Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. Kayleigh McEnany is the former White House press secretary and current co-host of Outnumbered on Fox News Channel. Prior to serving in the White House, Kayleigh worked as the national press secretary for the Trump campaign and formerly the national spokesperson for the Republican National Committee. And before joining the RNC, Kayleigh worked as a political commentator on CNN. When maybe she'll have some stories about that for us. When she was in the White House, her takedowns of the press were, I consider, legendary. And I told her if she can handle Jim Acosta on CNN, she can handle this crowd tonight. Am I right? Kayleigh graduated from Harvard Law School with a Juris Doctorate and Georgetown University School of Foreign Services with a degree in international politics. She also studied politics and international relations at Oxford University. She's a pretty smart lady. Kayleigh is a recipient of the Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service and the Department of Homeland Security's Secretary's Public Service Award. She's the author of the New York Times best-selling books For a Time Such as This and Serenity in the Storm, which I believe most of the VIP guests have a copy of tonight. And if you, I think we have a few books left out on the table if you want to grab some before we leave. So, without further ado, would you please help me give a nice and warm Mountain States Policy Center welcome to Kayleigh McEnany.
Thank you very much. That's very kind. It is a huge honor to be here. Thank you. Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I'm actually very familiar with the area. I say very, but I should say somewhat familiar. My husband has family that lives in Sandpoint, Idaho. So we spent a New Year's here in a snowy cabin, and it was beautiful and idyllic, and what a time that was. And I remember, funny, I heard the booing of CNN. I don't blame you there. It just occurred to me, I remember being in that snowy cabin and having to try to run to Spokane to do a CNN hit. And like, wow, you leave this beautiful, beautiful place to go be pummeled on national television by leftists. So that's was my role at CNN. But anyway, you know, a lot changed in my life since that snowy New Year to now. And it all kind of happened around 2020. I was formerly the press secretary over at the RNC, went on to the Trump campaign. And at the time on the Trump campaign, I had a newborn daughter. She was just a few months old. And I'm going around the country to all the places you think you would go for a presidential campaign, to New Hampshire and to Iowa and to South Carolina. And my mom was such a hero coming with me to these hotel rooms and setting up makeshift cribs for my little daughter. And I'd go off to the Trump rally and come back. Well, then all of a sudden, COVID-19 hit. And like that, everything went dormant. Everyone went into lockdown, at least in the DC area. So I went home to Florida. And I will say, if you have to lock down in Florida or here in Idaho, where you have beautiful nature. But I'm back in my home state of Florida, and I was not expecting the call that I received. I remember exactly where I was. I was sitting in the back seat. My daughter was in her car seat. My mom's driving the car. We're going over this bridge in Florida, and I get this call. And the call is an odd series of numbers. And typically, when you get this call with this odd series of numbers, it's the White House switchboard. I'd received maybe 2 calls previously to that moment. So I said, Mom, I think the President of the United States might be calling me right now. I answer my phone, and they say, this is the White House switchboard. We have President Trump here for you. Can you take his call? I'm like, of course, I'm going to take his call, of course. So I take a pink pacifier. I put it to my daughter's lips. I pray for the best. I pray she stays quiet. And I answer the phone. And he says, Kayleigh, I have a question for you. And I thought it was going to be, a question about an article I had written or a television appearance or, something minor. But he said, would you like to be my White House press secretary? was stunned by that. I immediately said yes, and he said something like, "Mark, get it done." And I think he meant Mark Meadows, get it done, his chief of staff, and Mark did get it done. So I take on this job, and it's an enormous role in the middle of a global pandemic, once in a generation global pandemic. It was surreal to think about. I had actually interned in the Bush administration in the Office of Media Affairs. And I remember going and watching a White House press briefing and watching Dana Perino stand there and field questions. And it's crazy to think that about 10 years later, I would be standing at that very podium, not as an intern anymore, but as White House press secretary. So I'm going up to DC, and we decide not to take a plane up there because I thought if the press saw me on a plane, they'd say, new White House press secretary endangering the life of the president during a pandemic on a plane. You know how they write those salacious headlines. So my husband and I thought the better of it, and we decided to ride up the Eastern Corridor from Florida all the way to Washington, D.C., and we're riding in his truck, and I'm trying to figure out how to do this job. I'm calling former press secretaries, calling people in the administration. I even looked for peer-reviewed academic journal articles about how to be a good press secretary. There's like one that exists, and I read it. And I'm preparing and trying to figure out how to do this. And my dad actually texted me something that brought me a lot of peace in that moment. He texted me, "Kayleigh, maybe you're made for such a time as this," an obvious reference to the book of Esther. And I believe sometimes when God wants to send you a message, he sends you the exact same message twice, sometimes through unlikely sources. And you can't get much different than my father, who's ideologically conservative, than Van Jones of CNN, who's very far left. But a few weeks into the job, he texted me and said, "Kayleigh, maybe you were made for such a time as this." And I knew it was something I was meant to hear. And I know it's a message for all of us that we are all here for a purpose, for a reason in this life, for such a time as this. I take the job, and my first day is April 13th, 2020. It's pouring rain outside. And on your first day in the White House, you have to go through this specific interest. So I walk the perimeter of the White House, rain pouring down. Not ideal way to start the job. The bottom of my pant leg is wet, and I'm sitting in the press secretary's office saying, this is my office, looking around like, wow, this moment is a big moment. I didn't really know how the day would progress. And about midway through the day, I get a call from the chief of staff's office, "Go to the Oval Office. President Trump's going to do a coronavirus task force briefing, and you need to brief the president." I had never been in the Oval Office before. As an intern, I had looked at it from the outside, but never had physically walked in until my first day on the job as I'm about to brief the president. And I remember exactly walking into this Oval Office. You see it on TV. Some of you might have seen it on West Wing tours. I pass this grandfather mahogany clock. I walk onto this sunbeam pattern rug from the Reagan administration. I sit on this gold couch, and I sit across from the Resolute desk, which was a gift to the United States from Queen Victoria back in the 1880s. And President Trump comes out and sits at the desk, and I'm sitting here watching him. And one of the things in press and communications is you have to learn how your boss consumes information. You have to learn how he preps for something, and you have to figure out how you can be value added in that situation. So I'm watching him, and I see he has a small binder like this, and he's reading his opening remarks, and he's flipping through the pages, and he's crossing out things he doesn't like and ripping off parts he doesn't like. It's like you could get someone to type that up for you, but he really took the initiative to do it himself. And I realized as I'm watching him prepare his opening remarks, I'm not going to have a lot of time to brief him on the questions and answers. And as he stands up, he's about to walk to the podium. I go, "Mr. President, I think I know what you're going to be asked today." And he said, "What's that?" I said, "Well, Dr. Fauci went on CNN and basically said something that's being misconstrued. And the suggestion that the press is making is if you would have mitigated sooner, maybe this pandemic wouldn't have blown up the way that it did." And he said, "Well, what would you say to that in response?" And at the time, I had all the facts in my head. And I said, "Here's what I would say. On January 6th of 2020, when there were 0 cases of COVID in the United States, what did you do? You issued a travel notice for Wuhan, 0 cases of COVID in the United States on January 17th. What did you do? You issued public health screenings at 3 major international airports, 1 case of COVID in January 21st. And what did you do? You opened an emergency operations center. And then on January 31st, not a single American had perished to COVID-19. And you issued a travel ban on China, one that your opponent called xenophobic." And he said, "Go type that up." So I run back to my office. I type it up as quickly as I can. I run it out to him. He goes to the podium with the paper. And it was really the first and only time I ever saw him take something out and read a response word for word. And I thought to myself, job well done on your first day. But in hindsight, I think that was just his way of making the newbie feel welcome on her first day. But I was very grateful to him for the show of kindness and the welcome. But when I took that job as press secretary, it had been 400 days since a press secretary had given a briefing. In fact, the last one was given by Sarah Huckabee Sanders, my predecessor. She's phenomenal. I love her. And I wasn't sure if I would ever be called upon to give a briefing. So I'm in this role and I'm thinking, is that day going to come? Is the president going to ask me to do this? And I remember one day, I think it was a Wednesday, he said, Kayleigh, I think I want you to do a briefing. I think to myself, okay, I've got to get this notebook together. I need a few weeks to get this together with my team. And the notebook, it's funny, it became a subject of interest to reporters. In fact, there was a camera behind my podium and the press would literally take snapshots of my binder and look at the tabs. And I remember CNN out with this headline, Decoding the Mysteries of Kayleigh McEnany's Briefing Binder. There really was no mystery. I mean, it's therapeutics, vaccine, COVID, whatever the topic was of the day. There's no mystery, but I did think one day I should have done a head fake where instead of like the topics on the tabs, I would have put a Jim Acosta, Caitlin Collins, like their names to show them I was keeping receipts. But didn't do that. So that was one regret. But so Wednesday, the president says, do a briefing. Then he says it again Wednesday afternoon. He says it Thursday. And I'm like, ooh, he's saying this a lot. I don't know if I'm going to have the weeks of time that I need. And then finally, Thursday afternoon, he goes, do a briefing and do it before Monday. So that left Friday. So we get ready. We had a wood-burning fireplace in my office and my team. I had two incredible staff members named Julia and Chad, and we would sit there and just for hours and hours go through every single possible question we could be asked. And we were around this wood-burning fireplace. I remember it vividly. And we would oftentimes identify the single hardest question. And the single hardest question was never asked, but we did our research and we always knew what that question would be. But before that first briefing on May 1st, 2020, I put in all the human academic preparation, work till 10 p.m. that night. But more important than that was the spiritual preparation. I listened to a Joyce Meyer sermon about faith over fear. I tweeted out Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And I listened to my Christian music and I felt very ready. But I went in to do the briefing that day and I became nervous, as any human would be in that situation. And I start getting texts from people around the nation, from Christians who said they were praying for me, and people, men and women of faith. And my predecessor, Sarah Sanders, she sent me a list of advice, and she's several pieces of advice, but the final piece was this. Most importantly, pray. Let God carry you through the tough times and give you strength when you don't have any wisdom. And she told me that she read her Jesus Calling devotional before every briefing, which is a tradition that I carried on. My team, we'd always say a prayer. It's the last thing that we did together before we walked to the podium. But she sent me on that day her devotional from exactly 2 years prior, and it said this: You are on the path of my choosing. There is no randomness about your life. As you give yourself more and more to a life of constant communion with me, you will find that you simply have no time to worry. But I worried that day. Worried a lot. I remember I go back to the Oval Office and the president's in his private dining area, and he was there with Jared Kushner and Mark Meadows and Vice President Mike Pence, who motioned towards me with praying hands and said he'd been praying for me. I said goodbye to them all. I prepared to go to the podium, and I went into this private West Wing bathroom, got on my knees, said a prayer. And when I walked to the podium, when I stood there and began speaking, I felt a total and complete serenity that is nothing of my doing. It was a supernatural peace that came because there were millions of people across the country that prayed for our administration. And if you were among them, I want to personally thank you, because I'm a testament that your prayers indeed worked and the peace I felt that day. And boy, was it a big task with the hyenas in the press briefing room. I had two goals when I stood there, and my first goal was to provide precise, clear, accurate information to the American people. And secondly, I really wanted to put a spotlight on the American people whose stories you don't hear, victims of crime, children's names who the press doesn't really cover when they opt instead for sensational journalism. And that's what we did. And a review of some of the questions is really quite eye-opening. In fact, Jen Psaki, who came after me, she was the first press secretary for President Biden, I put together a list of some of the questions she was asked, and you will not believe these. This is not parody. These are, in fact, questions that the White House press corps asked. Could you give us some color about what it was like for Joe Biden going into the Oval Office? He's been waiting for this for so long. What was his reaction? Never got that question. Will Joe Biden keep Donald Trump's Air Force One color scheme change? Nice one. Can you clarify for us what happened with the president's dogs? There's some reports that one of them was involved in a biting incident. Question. There's now been 2 dogs, several bites, by the way, since that question. And then my personal favorite, any update on the White House cat? These were actual questions that the press chose to ask. Now, here are some of the questions I was asked. Let me ask if I can, Kayleigh, why does the president keep hiring people who are dumb as a rock, overrated, way over their heads, wacko, and incompetent? So you've been using the phrase warriors to describe everyday Americans fighting the pandemic. The president's using that phrase as well. What's the thinking behind using that description? And is that basically asking Americans to put themselves in harm's way like warriors do? I think the president was just saying we're fighting through a pandemic together, but nevertheless, that's the press. And then there's the question I was asked where I'm flipping through my briefing binder. And if you go back and watch the clip, I stop what I'm doing. I stare up in total bewilderment because I cannot believe the question that I am asked. And it was this: does President Trump believe that it was a good thing that the South lost the Civil War? They say there is no such thing as a dumb question. That is, in fact, a very dumb question. So as I took this job, my dad, who's really a natural born leader, he built a company, much like many of you in this room, from the ground up. I mean, he had nothing. He came from, his dad died when he was young. He was raised by a single mom. He ended up building a company and became a successful business leader through free market and through the great state of Florida and the wonderful conservative laws that we have there that enabled that. But I sought advice from him as I took this job, and he told me to come up with a phrase for my office. He said, stick it on walls, tell your whole team a phrase that would inspire your mission. And I quickly realized that for any Republican press secretary, the mission for me, you're going to be dealing with a hostile press corps, was offense only. We were going to be on offense. We were not going to be on defense. We were not going to take the bait of the questions, but we were going to be on offense. And we did some rather creative things during my time. I don't know if you noticed, there was a lot of hypocrisy with the COVID mandates. Lori Lightfoot, my favorite, she was asked about getting her hair done. And she said, I'm the public face of this city. I'm on national media and I'm out in the public eye. As if that's a reason to flout the very mandates you're putting on the people of Chicago. You know, Gavin Newsom, we all remember French Laundry, right? You know, he's out, everyone else in California locked down. And Nancy Pelosi, I hope you remember the footage of her in the hair salon. And the salon owner let that footage out. Well, as soon as that footage came out, I knew what we were going to do with it at the podium. I said, I began my briefing on September 3rd. 2 briefings ago, I asked, where is Nancy Pelosi? Today, I can announce we have found Nancy Pelosi. As you can see, we found Nancy Pelosi going into her hair salon. We will be playing the video on loop for all of you to see during the duration of this introduction. That is offense only, and that is what we did. But more importantly, and although those were fun, creative times to be on offense, was, as I mentioned, highlighting the stories that the media chooses not to cover. You know, I can't believe I just learned about this housing issue tonight. Why is that not something we know about? It's something that Mountain States Policy Center is working on and is changing. But the fact that I didn't know about it, that's, you know, media malpractice, that it's not covered in the way that it should be. Another issue that was not covered in the way that it should be is crime. There was a huge crime wave during 2020. Unfortunately, many children lost their life. And I remember being at a briefing after a weekend where in New York, there were 44 shootings, 11 people killed, Chicago, 75 people shot, 13 killed, and at least 5 of the individuals were children. I'm standing at the podium and I'm listening to the questions come in. Question after question after question. about President Trump's feelings about the Confederate flag. And there are literally 4 children who had died in Chicago that weekend. Not a single question about that. And I finally said, I was asked probably 12 questions about the Confederate flag. This president is focused on action. I'm a little dismayed. I didn't receive one question on the deaths that we got in the country this weekend. I didn't receive one question about New York City shootings, doubling for the 3rd straight week. And over the last 7 days, shootings skyrocketed by 142%. Not one question. I didn't receive one question about 5 children who were killed. Well, unbeknownst to the press, who tried to make Donald Trump out to be a monster, that is what they did. Unbeknownst to them, the president actually, at the recommendation of someone on my staff, she came to me, a young girl, and said, I think we should write letters to these families that lost children to crime. And I told the president, and he readily agreed and sent letters, hand-signed, I watched him sign them, to families around the country that lost their children in a crime incident, one that might have been covered by their local press but didn't get the national attention it deserved. But that was the kind of person he was, the kind of boss he was, and that's the way that he cared about the country. I will say, since I left the administration, there has been a lot of vindication on so many stories. And one of the frustrating things when you're a Republican in press and communications is when the story that the press is peddling turns out to be false. There are not retracted headlines. There are not people who are fired. There is no accountability for the incorrect narrative that has been sold to the nation. And one such incident I remember was Lafayette Square. The president, if you'll remember, Lafayette Square is in front of the White House. He walked through Lafayette Square and held up a Bible and took a picture. Well, here was the headline from NPR. Peaceful protesters tear gas to clear way for Trump church photo op. Washington Post, inside the push to tear gas protesters ahead of a Trump photo op. The Washington Post even went so far as to say from Tiananmen Square to Lafayette Square. They literally compared the two. Well, in a briefing, Jim Acosta said to me this, Kayleigh, you mentioned Dr. King. He likely would not have approved of what took place Monday evening across from the White House, as you probably know. If the White House, the president and his team had to do it all over again, would you have gassed and pummeled protesters to clear the park so that the president could have a photo op? And I made clear to the press that that didn't happen. I said it over and over again. They ran with the story. Everyone believed it was true. But oh, wait, several months later, after the administration ended, the Inspector General for the U.S. Department of Interior found we determined that the evidence did not support a finding that the U.S. Park Police cleared the park on June 1st, 2020, so that President Trump could enter the park. It was a false narrative all along. Fast forward to the Russia bounty story. I remember this one vividly. The story was that Russia had bounties on the heads of U.S. service members in Afghanistan, and that President Trump had done nothing to stop them, nothing to protect our troops. It was in the New York Times. And I said, this is not verified. There's no consensus in the intelligence community on this. And in fact, there are dissenting views. And I said, before buying into a narrative from the New York Times that falsely states something about the president, wait for the facts to come out. They didn't wait. Biden accused Trump of dereliction of duty. He used that term. They didn't wait. The press ran with the headlines. But oh, wait, 10 months later, and just to back up for a moment, the New York Times actually went and found service members, Gold Star families of service members who had lost their lives in Afghanistan, and tried to tell them the narrative that the president didn't care and elicit responses from them. So that's how far they took the story. I can't imagine the pain of being a Gold Star parent, and I can't believe or imagine how much that must be amplified if you're told your commander-in-chief did nothing to protect that service member abroad. So that's what the New York Times said. 10 months later, the Daily Beast, not a right-wing source, the Daily Beast, a left-wing source, in fact, said, U.S. intelligence walks back the claim that Russians put bounties on American troops. It was a huge election time story that prompted cries of treason, but according to a newly disclosed assessment, Donald Trump might have been right to call it a hoax. False narrative. Again, then you fast forward to the COVID lab leak theory. President Trump surmised one day, maybe the coronavirus leaked from a lab that was working on coronavirus in Wuhan. Not so crazy, right? What was crazy to the press? USA Today, Trump says U.S. investigating whether coronavirus spread after China lab mishap, but cites no evidence. NPR, scientists debunk lab accident theory of pandemic emergence. Washington Post actually had a fact check on it, fact checked it as false. But a year later, Washington Post, how the Wuhan lab leak theory suddenly became credible, just suddenly. And the list goes on, whether it's Hunter Biden's laptop, the list goes on and on of all of the false stories, all the things we were told that are corrected so many years later. But that's the state of the American press, unfortunately. But it's as, refreshing as it is to look back and remember some of the good times and, reflect on some of the bad times with the press. I think it's important to look forward. And what Mountain States Policy Center is doing is huge. I was reading about the vision. State Policy Network's vision is an America where all people can flourish because collaborative entrepreneurial leaders have secured lasting social change, personal freedom, and economic opportunity at the state and local level. Education freedom, personal freedom. What a mission that is, an important mission, no doubt. Made all the more important, and we've talked a lot about, the state government and the way in which the state government has taken away freedoms and tried to squelch the free market and make it harder for business owners like my father, who is the American dream. He is. But at the federal level, and I know Mountain States Policy Center works on that as well, at the federal level, you also see this control over personal freedom, control over the American people. This was a little reported story, one that should have gotten a lot of attention, but it didn't. Jim Jordan, he has the Weaponization on Government Committee, and here's what he found. He found something called the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, called FinCEN. And here's what the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network was doing. They're going out, trying to find people committing financial crimes. Well, what they found was they created search terms, typologies of people who are likely to commit financial crimes. Well, guess what these search terms were that they encouraged people to search Zelle transactions for? Trump and MAGA. Trump and MAGA. So that is what the government was saying you should search for if you're looking for someone who committed a financial crime. Gets worse. There were extremism indicators that they put out. Guess what an extremism indicator was for our federal government? The purchase of books, including religious texts, and subscription to other media containing extremist views. Wow, that sounds like innocent, good, hardworking people wanting to pray, wanting to read scripture. But in fact, that is an extremism indicator. The FBI ended up pulling down this whole process of looking through transactions because they found that the leads lacked allegations of federal criminal conduct. So it turns out if you are Trump, MAGA, or reading a scriptural text, perhaps you're not the person committing the financial crime. There was no tie between the search term and the outcome. But we've seen the federal government encroaching on our personal freedom, not just in this one example, but these headlines tell the story. NPR, IRS apologizes for aggressive scrutiny of conservative groups. Remember that one? CNN, special counsel John Durham concludes FBI never should have launched full Trump-Russia probe. Remember that one? I'm sure you all do. New York Times, officials who cast doubt on Hunter Biden laptop face questions. Remember the 51 intel officers who told us not to believe what we were seeing during the election. Fox News, heavily redacted records show FBI's targeting of Catholics went beyond what it claimed. There was a memo that they were going to put plants in Catholic churches and Catholic masses, and that was in an FBI field office. Yahoo News, DOJ talked with White House before issuing domestic terrorism school protest memo. Do you remember that? Parents at the school board meeting, they're domestic terrorists that needed to be looked at and targeted. And then finally, Fox News, pro-life leader denounces FBI DOJ's prosecution of activists. Mark Houck, a father of 7, had his home raided at gunpoint simply because he was advocating for a son, defending his son in front of a clinic. But thankfully, we have juries in this country, and he was acquitted. But this is the federal government encroaching on our everyday lives. And what's funny is really COVID-19 showed us who among our state governors was an autocrat, who among our state governors was a despot, and who was not. And I say this because COVID-19 happens, and all of a sudden the lockdowns happen, right? Businesses locked down, personal freedom taken away, your ability to make money, churches shut down, synagogues shut down, everything shut down. Some reopened quickly, like the state of Florida, others did not. But the reason I bring this up is because when you look at the Supreme Court and the way the cases were going, as all of these Orwellian laws across the country were being challenged, it tells a pretty frightening story about just how close we were to really losing our freedoms. In California, Gavin Newsom, what a piece of work he is. I remember President Trump called me quickly into his office one day and I was about to go out to do a briefing. He said, no, briefing's all going to be different because today I'm marching to the podium and I'm going to declare houses of worship as essential places that need to be open. So he declared that churches, synagogues, mosques would be essential, but the liberal governors across the country fought back. Governor Gavin Newsom put in place these really terrible restrictions on houses of worship that were not put on other private sector businesses. And the Supreme Court upheld his restrictions in a 5-4 ruling. Justice Kavanaugh wrote this in dissent. The basic constitutional problem is that comparable secular businesses are not subject to a 25% occupancy cap, including factories, offices, supermarkets, restaurants, retail stores, pharmacies, shopping malls, pet grooming shops, bookstores, florists, hair salons, and cannabis dispensaries. Because that's what our founders intended, right? Open the cannabis dispensaries, shut the churches, right? So Gavin Newsom upheld. Then you move over to Nevada, and you had the Supreme Court once again uphold these restrictions. Justice Alito wrote in dissent, the Constitution guarantees the free exercise of religion. It says nothing about the freedom to play craps or blackjack, to feed tokens into a slot machine, or to engage in any other game of chance. But the governor of Nevada apparently has different priorities. But something very important happened. All of these governors, their restrictions, and it wasn't just churches, on places of businesses as well, as you well know, all of a sudden something happened, and it happened just before the 2020 election, and that was the nomination and the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett, which changed everything. Amy Coney Barrett makes her way to the court, and then what happens? New York Governor Chris Cuomo, remember when he used to have a job? New York Governor, not Chris Cuomo, that's his brother on CNN, Andrew Cuomo, I should say. Cuomo Brothers, quite a pair. But you had Andrew Cuomo, who had these restrictions, and all of a sudden Amy Coney Barrett's on the court and he's struck down. Justice Gorsuch wrote, it turns out that the businesses the governor considers essential include hardware stores, acupuncturists, liquor stores, bicycle repair shops, certain signage companies, accountants, lawyers, and insurance agents are all essential too. So at least according to the governor, it may be unsafe to go to church, but it's always fine to pick up another bottle of wine, shop for a new bike, or spend the afternoon exploring your distal points and meridians. Who knew public health would so perfectly align with secular convenience? And then, finally, Governor Newsom challenged yet again. And what happened? He's finally struck down. He wasn't just struck down once, not twice, not 3 times, not 4 times, but actually 5 times. And one of those cases, the most recent, was Tandem v. Newsom, where he was literally trying to regulate the number of people in a home that could gather in private prayer. That's what he was trying to do in the great state of California. Not so great. And that's why States Policy Center, I should say, so important to be on the front lines of education freedom, of free markets, because in the same way you have these governors targeting churches, they target private sector businesses. They target education. They try to take your freedom away. Like in the state of New Jersey, where they literally have parental secrecy policies. So if your child decides, I'm changing my gender today, I'm changing my name, they have a policy that you don't, in fact, inform the parent. California has a similar one as well. But as all these victories are happening at the court, victories, I would note, not just for churches, but places of business as well. Here's how the media decided to treat it. Reuters said litigation over COVID has proved to be an accelerant thanks to the court's so-called shadow doctrine, giving it multiple occasions to decide religious freedom issues on emergency motions, providing little reasoning. CNN said, how the Supreme Court is dismantling the separation of church and state. So that's what CNN's take. Vox said the Supreme Court is leading a Christian conservative revolution. Vanity Fair, no victory for religious liberty and ruling for praying football coach. The Supreme Court smashes what's left of separation between church and state. That was the takeaway of the press. But this is why, the reason I share this with you is, as Mountain States Policy Center is on the front lines of so many battles, it's going to be imperative that you work through the courts. And the courts were completely and entirely remade thanks to my former boss, President Trump. 54 appellate justices. That represented 1/3 of the appellate judiciary were the number of judges that he appointed. 174 district court judges. He appointed the most judges since Carter. These are freedom-loving judges, judges that will be with you as you fight the Orwellian hand of the state and the federal government. You know, religious education freedom, just look at what happened there. There was a case of the Supreme Court called Carson v. Macon. It was a case in Maine, and it was about school choice. Maine allows their residents to go and choose whichever school you want to go to with a certain amount of funding that you can take to whatever school of your choosing, except the state of Maine said, you can't go to a religious school. Well, the Supreme Court said, nope, strike that down. School choice means the freedom to choose a parochial school, a religious school, or any school of your choosing. That is now the law of the land. Thanks to Amy Coney Barrett, Justice Gorsuch, and Justice Kavanaugh. You know, you're going to be on the vanguard of this fight here in Idaho, here in the Mountain State region, and the precedents that you set by supporting this organization can have federal precedent that then affects the rest of the nation. You can be on the vanguard and very much differentiate yourself from some of the things that we see come out of California and the like. But all of this to be said, you know, people may have different political views in this room, and there's no problem with that. But, you know, my dad always used to say to me, you know, Kayleigh, what's your worldview? What's your worldview? And I always thought that was kind of crazy. I was like, what do you mean worldview? Like growing up, I didn't know what that meant. And then they became very clear to me as I left my state of Florida and went off to CNN and Harvard and these liberal institutions. I figured out what my worldview was. And my political worldview was shaped by riding with my dad in his truck and listening to the late, great Rush Limbaugh. He informed my entire thinking. I am, in fact, a Rush baby. But even more importantly than that political worldview was my faith worldview. I gave my life to Jesus Christ when I walked down the aisle of my Southern Baptist church, and I became a Christian. And it framed how I lead my life, how I go about this life. And there was a moment, I had left college, I went to Georgetown, I left DC, I go to New York City, and I take my first job. And my first job was for Governor Mike Huckabee. And it's funny how God works. I'm running around this green room with this girl named Sarah Huckabee, who neither of us knew, this man, Donald Trump, would run and be president and that we would end up being in the same role. I mean, it's just crazy how God works. But in that job, I loved my job, but I was very lonely. I was going to this church called the Journey Church. And I remember being at the Journey Church and they said, New York City, Manhattan is a place where you're surrounded by tons of people, millions of people, but it can feel like the loneliest place on earth. And indeed, it did feel that way. So I left work one day and I went to my windowless apartment facing a building. Gosh, you got to appreciate Idaho. It's so beautiful out here. And in this windowless apartment, and I'm trying to call my mom, call whoever I can. I just wanted to talk to someone. I was going through a breakup, which in hindsight was silly, but at the time seemed very important. But no one was answering their phone. And then my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. And I said, I'm going to pick this up. Even if it's a telemarketer, that's just fine. I'll talk with them. So I answer the phone, and I kid you not, the words that I hear are, this is the Journey Church. We feel like we need to pray for you. How can we pray for you? And it came just after I had said, God, if you're out there, I need to hear from you. And I will tell you, it is a neat, wonderful, incomparable thing to get a call from a commander-in-chief saying, will you be my press secretary? But it is even more impactful and important when you get a call from an emissary of Christ directly to your phone line, which is what happened to me that day, the most important call I ever received in my life. This is a little bit about my faith walk, my journey. Thank you. This is a little bit about my faith walk and my journey and a little bit about who I am. But I just want to encourage all of you in this room, the same way that when I'm riding up to DC, I get the text from my dad, maybe you're here for such a time as this. All of you in this room supporting this important mission here tonight, all of you are going to be used, whether you're going through tough times, good times, hard times, whatever it is, God will use your battle, your triumph, your valley, your peak for his doing if you let him. So thank you so much for having me. And you all are here for such a time as this. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Wow. That was terrific. Thank you very much, Kayleigh.